Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event. It's wonderful to have you here. I'm Julian Huppert. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum, and it's wonderful to have you here in person or online for this incredibly special event. And before we have our guest speaker tonight to give this amazing lecture, I'm delighted to hand over to the Master of Jesus College, Sunita Elaine, to start us off. Sunita, wonderful to have you here.
Thank you very much, Julian. Welcome everyone to Jesus College and to this year's Lisa Jardine Memorial Lecture. This is our annual lecture commemorating Lisa Jardine's life, her extraordinary scholarship, and her very, very important role in the history of Jesus College. Now, it's a history that started in 1496. The college's history started in 1496, when the then Bishop of Ely somehow managed to take over the convent and oust the women who were its principal occupants. Well, Lisa reversed that pattern a few years later, when she became the first female fellow at Jesus College. Well, I say a few years, but she was elected in 1976. So that was a really pioneering move. She was a scholar with a very, very impressive intellectual range. Her interests spanned from English literature and cultural history to the history of science. She published books on Robert Hooke, Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, Erasmus, the scientific revolution, and much, much more. She bridged the world of academia and brought her way of thinking, her analysis and insight into the field of policy making. She was prolific. She was a member of the Council of the Royal Institution. She held an advisory role at the Royal Society, and she spent 6 years as chair of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority from 2008 to 2014. On a personal note, I became aware of Lisa Jardine long before I became the Master of Jesus College. Growing up, I grew up in East London, in Leytonstone and Leyton. But growing up, and it was back in the days when there was no internet, there was no mobile phones, and very, very few TV channels, although at the time we didn't realise that there were very, very few TV channels. But she was on our screens all the time. I remember as a young teenager just finding her a really inspiring, smart and funny and insightful woman. And for me, she was the consummate broadcaster, able to impart ideas, tell stories, and be an exemplar of what it meant in those days to be a thought leader. It's highly appropriate that journalist, broadcaster, and ex-master of Oxbridge College, Alan Rusbridger, is here with us tonight to give this year's Lisa Jardine Lecture. But before Alan starts, I'd like to invite Dr. Julian Huppert, Director of Jesus College's Intellectual Forum, to properly introduce Alan Rusbridger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunita. And it's a great pleasure to have Alan here to give this lecture. Alan will be known by many of you for many of his roles. He was, in fact, a student here, not at this college, sadly. He used to be Magdalen. He's cheered up since then, however. He got into journalism at the Cambridge Evening News, which used to be one of the great local papers, and was there for many years. And we'll hear some of that work here, because I think that's how he got to know Lisa. He then moved on to another local newspaper, The Guardian, and was the editor-in-chief there for 20 years, and made such a huge difference, covering a huge range of fascinating and amazing stories. One could think about phone hacking and the £1 billion, I think it was, that so far cost the Murdoch empire. Or one could talk about some of the stories with Snowden. In fact, he and I worked together a bit on some aspects of that. But there were many, many others. And also overseeing the transition of The Guardian into much more of the digital age, when it was possible to have a website that would provide so much that newsprint used to do. Since leaving The Guardian, he has gone on to be head of a college in Oxford, Lady Margaret Hall, making a huge difference there, innovating, bringing many new things. He's also served on the Facebook Oversight Board, dealing with one of the biggest challenges of the new media that we face. He has many, many other talents, one of which is being an exceptionally good pianist, and somebody who will go to great lengths to lift a piano up into his flat in order to be able to play it. Alan, it is so good to have you with us here today to talk about Lisa and to talk about the media. Thank you for giving this wonderful lecture. I look forward to hearing from you. Alan.
Well, thank you, Sonia. Thank you for that generous introduction, Julian. Very nice to have John here. And when John emailed me and asked me if I would do this, he said this evening, I didn't hesitate for long. I didn't hesitate at all. I thought I can't not do this in Lisa's memory. And it's a great honor to be here and to speak in her honor. My favorite picture of Lisa is this one, which was, I think, gives you some indication that she was a rather atypical fellow of Jesus College. And that was during her period when she was campaigning against the development that would have buried the kite area of Cambridge under, I think the plan was originally for 2 dual carriageways, about 5 multi-storey car parks, and much else. I think it was the first real campaign she had done, and I found somebody who was immensely energetic, fearless, warm, practical, tireless, funny, and I think it was this campaign while she was here that gave her this appetite for campaigning. She's there with Daniel and Rachel, her children, and I was the reporter who was allocated to write about this for the Cambridge Evening News. And I wondered, last night I was putting these slides together, and I wondered if I could find these articles, and there it is, and there's Lisa's name, and maybe not many people will remember Councillor John Powley, who went on to be an MP, but you can't read that there, but I quoted him as saying, quoting the people he met on this visit to the kite as trespassers and silly little girls. And I think he meant Lisa. And he also described them as layabouts who didn't do an honest day's work. And I think he also meant Lisa. And he couldn't have been more wrong in his assessment either of Lisa or of what the kite area of Cambridge needed. It's quite a useful starting point of what I want to talk about tonight, because that job of being a reporter and going down and standing on the sidelines as an independent witness and saying this happened, this didn't happen, this is a fact, this isn't a fact, he said this, he didn't say that, was the sort of basis of journalism that I learnt on a local newspaper. And that's what I want to speak about tonight, this craft of journalism. And I think the way that, in many ways, that craft of journalism has been forgotten at a time when it's most needed. So that's the journey I'm going to take you on tonight. And I'm going to begin 157 years earlier. It's really interesting. You go around schools talking about the Peterloo Massacre and people look blank. It's not something they teach in schools nowadays. But it was a tremendously important moment in British history. And for those of you who don't know about the Peterloo Massacre, it was a gathering in St. Peter's Square in Manchester, in which the orator Henry Hunt, standing there in the middle, was considered such a danger by the magistrates that they sent the cavalry into the crowd. And we know the death toll and the toll of people injured. We know them, we know that fact because there was a reporter on the spot. Mike Leigh has made quite a good film. It's quite an instructive film. It's not necessarily the most entertaining film about the Peterloo Massacre. And the crucial question that people wanted to know once they'd cleared the square was, well, what happened? Were the cavalry acting in self-defense, or was this an unprovoked attack on the crowd? And this man was in the crowd. He was a Manchester businessman, John Edward Taylor, and he knew what was going to happen. He knew that the authorities would lie about this, and that somebody had to write down and get an account of the truth out. And he wrote it down. There was, in fact, a reporter from the Times there called John Tyus, but he had been either arrested or he was unable to write. So John Edward Taylor wrote an account and put it on the mail coach to London. And you can look at the Times now and find the editor of the Times, a great man called Thomas Barnes, over the coming days, trying to establish how would you establish what the facts were in 1819. And he used some very modern techniques, if you can put it like that. And over the ensuing days, he gave pages and pages over to it. And one way of doing it was literally crowdsourcing, people in the crowd who would write to the Times and say, I was there and I saw this, and he printed them all. He used a technique that we would now call aggregation, which is there were other reporters from local newspapers there, and he quoted them. And you could see an editor trying to establish what the facts were. And eventually, by the time he had decided that he knew what the facts were, he was able to write an editorial talking about the dreadful fact that the cavalry had murdered the lives of the meanest Englishmen. And that was just that classic act of reporting that I did for the Cambridge Evening News when I was reporting on Lisa and the kite demonstrations. And John Edward Taylor was right in his assessment of what was going to happen, that the authorities would tell a barrel of lies about it. And for weeks, you might say years, in fact, historians were still arguing about this 100 years later. There was a big split between the forces on the left on that side and the forces on the right. Forces on the left, the bad guys, the forces on the right, the good guys. Each had their own tame newspaper, because at that point the press was very attached. It was attached. They were paid by the political parties over what had happened. Why did it matter? That was the assessment of the Guardian historian in 1921, the centenary of the Guardian, that the narratives which appeared in print within 48 hours of the massacre were never overtaken by the official version. And the historian E.P. Thompson, writing in 1957, said, never since Peterloo has authority dared to use equal force against a peaceful British citizen. The Guardian historian described that as the debut of the reporter in English public life. And the significance of this was that John Edward Taylor, having had that experience of realizing the importance of ascertaining the facts and of reporting on them, then went on to found the Manchester Guardian, the paper that I edited for 20 years, and that was the first edition on May the 5th, 1821. And the greatest editor of the Manchester Guardian came up with probably the only dictum on journalism that anyone has ever heard of in that same year of 1921, which is that comment is free, but facts are sacred. And you could almost have that as a text for our times, because the world is now swimming with comment, and yet the number of facts that we can all agree are facts is in a way a diminishing quantity. And I have this sense that we're almost retreating to a world before 1819, where the difficulty of establishing facts is becoming harder, not easier. And this business of not just having facts, but agreed facts that we can all agree on is the crucial thing, because you can't have justice, obviously, unless you can agree what the facts were. It's very difficult to have government, law, science, or I would say a functioning society. I'm going to come and talk about climate change in a bit, but if you can't agree on the fact that the climate change is happening, then you're never going to have the political ability to do the things that are needed. We saw a bit of that during COVID as well. So this question of how you have a society that has agreed facts is really important. And there was a moment when I was editing, this was in 2009, which was a sort of, a microcosm of Peterloo, when a man called Ian Tomlinson, who was a news seller in the City of London, died during a G20 protest. And what did the authorities do? They came out with their version of events, that this guy had a heart attack, he died of natural causes, caught among the mob. And there was one reporter on The Guardian, a man called Paul Lewis, who wasn't sure that he believed this. So he put out an appeal on social media and said, could you all go through your camera rolls? Because everyone by then had a mobile phone with a camera. And did anyone see what happened? And there was a guy in New York who looked through his camera roll. He'd been in London, and he actually had a video of Ian Tomlinson walking past these policemen, and a policeman coshed him on the back of the head. He went down, hit his head on the pavement, and that's how he died. So it was a sort of an echo of Peterloo, that here the authorities, their instinct, unfortunately, is often not to tell the truth. And somehow it is the job of the news organization to come up with the version of the truth. Here we are, we're in the third week of February, and I think the last month has been an illustration of why this matters. I'm just going to play a 90-second clip of one of the interviews that Donald Trump has given since coming to the presidency barely a month ago.
Welcome back to Hannity, and here is more of our exclusive White House Oval Office interview with President Donald J. Trump.
So you did run on a platform. You were very straightforward. You said you would pardon these people that were sentenced for January 6th.
Yeah, totally.
You did. The only criticism or pushback I've seen is about people that were convicted or were involved in incidents where they were violent with police. Why did they get a pardon?
A number of reasons. Number one, they were in there for 3.5 years, a long time.
Right.
And in many solitary confinement, treated like nobody's ever been treated so badly. They were treated like the worst criminals in history. And you know what they were there for? They were protesting the vote, because they knew the election was rigged and they were protesting the vote. And that you should be allowed to protest a vote. You should be allowed to. You know, when the day comes...
But you shouldn't be able to invade the Capitol.
No, ready? Most of the people were absolutely innocent. Okay, but forgetting all about that, these people have served horribly a long time. It would be very, very cumbersome to go and look. You know how many people we're talking about? 1,500 people. Almost all of them should not have been, this should not have happened. And the other thing is this, some of those people with the police, true, but they were very minor incidents, okay? You know, they get built up by a couple of fake guys that are on CNN all the time.
Nobody watches.
They were very minor incidents, and it was time.
So I cut about 10 lies during the process of that 90 seconds. But I mean, it's quite interesting if you just think that is on Fox News. And Fox News, we know from a libel settlement with Dominion Computers last year, where Murdoch was forced to pay nearly $800 million in damages because Fox were knowingly telling lies about the January 6th insurrection and the aftermath. So it's quite interesting that Fox is the conveyor of these. And I mean, those are just the things that if you were news editing on the night, you'd want to check every single line of everything that he said there. But what's happened in the last month has been a deluge of these statements, where almost nothing should be taken at face value, and quite a lot of it is completely untrue. The Washington Post last time they had a sort of running tally, and during the course of the first Trump presidency, they found nearly 31,000 lies or misleading claims over 4 years. And it feels almost as if we've reached that in 4 weeks. So here is the function of the press, and I don't want to labour the point of making the point that arguably at the moment the role of people who stand in society and can be relied to come up with the facts has never been greater. Now, you remember that slide, which was the competing elements after Peterloo, and they boiled really down into three groups of people. There were the state actors, the magistrates, the Home Secretary, and the state. There was the public who'd been there on the day, who would sign petitions saying we were there and this didn't happen. And then you had the press. Those three elements are, as it were, still there. The Times is still with us, God bless it. It now reaches about 1 million people a day. There is the state, who is able to reach 96 million people a day with a single tweet, probably an order many times that. So he doesn't need the press to speak to the people any longer. But the one that's really, that was the petition after Peterloo, and what has happened now is the ability of anybody who has a mobile phone to become a publisher, and Facebook now has 2.1 billion monthly users. So you've got the same three elements, but what has changed is the one body that could hold people to account is now relatively tiny. And what has happened is this world of information chaos where billions of people can now charge in and say, this happened, this didn't happen. This has coincided with this really staggering growth of social media has happened and coincided with a rapid decline in at least printed newspapers, and also a catastrophic decline in trust. So whichever way you measure it, whether you measure journalists against other people in society, journalists in Britain against journalists in other countries, I could show you 100 such charts of people where journalists in Britain, particularly in the printed press, come the worst. We're not quite the worst in that chart. We're just ahead of North Macedonia and Greece. In that chart, we are the worst. And this has been a pattern that has been pretty consistent for 20 years. That any survey that you did of trust would conclude that the British press is very untrustworthy. And so you've got this paradox that at the very moment when you need these observers in society to cut their way through the information chaos and tell us the agreed facts, actually nobody believes us. And for years, the British press behaved like Millwall supporters, and their reaction was, well, we know nobody likes us, and we don't care, and we must be doing something right if everybody hates us. And the sheer shrug of the shoulders that has happened collectively amongst the British press for 20 years, yeah, we know our trust our trust levels are abysmal, but it in a sense is not there was remarkably incurious as to why this was happening. But one chart that came out of the Reuters Institute recently had this really startling figure that the figures of trust in news generally are about 15% lower than before Brexit. And that's including the public service broadcasters like the BBC and Channel 4 News, which are relatively highly trusted. And that sentence there, more opinionated news brands tend to have lower trust levels in our survey along with tabloids. So you'd think there was a clue there that the British press might sort of think, okay, we're doing something wrong, we're very untrusted. We can see the BBC, which is, we can argue about how impartial it is, but people seem to like less opinionated news. And yet, what I want to look at is the two most consequential events of perhaps our recent lifetimes. and how the news media reacted and whether they rose to the challenge or not. And the first one is Brexit. And I think I could do this without upsetting anybody on either side, but we'll see. So Brexit, hugely consequential, and each one of us was being asked to make a decision based on our knowledge of what the factors were in play. And I wasn't editing, I was sitting in Oxford, and I kind of knew what I wanted journalism to do for me. I thought, well, this is an immensely consequential decision, and please arm me with the facts. Please tell me the arguments on both sides so that I can make the best possible decision. And that's not what happened. A spoiler. And what happened, I think, was through the pattern of three things. One was that journalism really couldn't handle the complexity, or didn't want to get engaged with the complexity of the situation. British journalism was very good at jokes. That was the second one. And thirdly, British journalism is tremendously driven by ideology. And these three things came through. And it wasn't so much that this was the overriding theme of the referendum itself, though it was, but this was a pattern of British journalism that had built up over 20 years. The British press had, when I say the British press, the 2/3 of the British press that had decided they didn't like Europe, had decided 20 years previously, and it was a very long campaign. There's the former bureau chief of the FT saying why it was such a difficult story to cover, not appealing for editors at a time. So you've got the same time as that slide I was showing you, the British newspaper slides in decline, and this very difficult story to make, to bring to life. There's the Italian correspondent, the Corriere della Sera. It's a boring story. And enter this man, who was sent to Brussels as the correspondent of the Telegraph. And that was the verdict of one of his colleagues. He wasn't making things up necessarily, just over-egging to a degree that was dishonest. He played the Telegraph game brilliantly. I told Boris in a jokey way, "You're writing out of your arse." Not making things up necessarily is not a great testimonial for a journalist, particularly after he had been sacked from the Times for doing precisely that. But anyway, Boris comes into town, and we've got his biographer, Sonia Purnell, who chronicled his. He realized that the way to sell Brussels was to either invent stories or come close to inventing stories. So if he could write a story saying that the EC was to ban prawn cocktail crisps, he was guaranteed a place on the front page of the Telegraph, and then the EC officials would have to come in and issue a rebuttal. But there's Sonia Purnell. He was becoming so prolific and eye-catching that the journalists on rival newspapers were instructed to follow up his stories, even when they seemed to have little basis in fact. So here was this star correspondent who had found a way of making Europe sounding interesting, and to get them to be an enemy. This was probably his most consequential story, and Sonia Purnell dug into it to find out the origins of it. And I also spoke to the Guardian's correspondent, John Palmer at the time. I think it's agreed that this story on page 20 of The Guardian was the origin of that story. And John Palmer said it was just, it was right to put it on page 20 because it was about Delors' thinking on the next stages of political integration. And then he said, Boris came up to me when it appeared and asked whether I'd seen the relevant documents. He then rewrote my story and completely distorted it to say Delors' plans to rule Europe. And there it was on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph. That hasn't quite translated into PowerPoint, but it was Boris's description of how he had egged up the original John Palmer story sold it to the Sunday Telegraph. The Sunday Telegraph then exited out, and even Johnson was slightly shocked to see this leading the Sunday Telegraph and thought that was a bit over-egging it. But that was what he said to the BBC some years later, chucking these rocks over the garden wall, listening to the amazing crash from the greenhouse next door over in England. And there you get this sense of frankly, dishonesty in reporting, but also this sort of jokiness. The British journalism has never really sort of taken itself seriously. There's always this undertow of jokiness. And if you go to the EU website now, you'll find the EU just ream after ream of stories that the British press has done, which don't even have a minimum of truth about them. But they worked as stories. They worked as what we would now call clickbait. That if you could write a story about bent bananas or prawn crisps, that other people would write them for other. There's Brussels bans barmans from bearing chests, and some humorless person in the EU has to say, no, that's not what this directive says. And this sort of tradition of making jokes about Europe was manifested in some famous front pages. And these were papers that sold 3 or 4 million copies at the time. And it's all a bit of a laugh. But that's what happened during the referendum and then the run-up to the referendum, which was much less of a laugh. So the use of front pages, not to tell you what is happening, but to convey the impression of whatever the editor thought was the most important message that they wanted to convey about why you should vote one way. So these were papers that were not going to give you both sides of the argument. They were going to give you one side of the argument, and they would begin with comment, and that thread of comment would run right through the news reporting. There were extraordinary things happening. That was the owner of the Daily Express at the time, a former pornographer called Richard Desmond. And the first day of the campaign, he writes £1 million cheque to Nigel Farage, has himself photographed with him. And at that point, you might think, well, at that point, the Daily Express stops being a newspaper. It's not the person standing on the side of this story. It's a player in the story that has decided that it knows what its readers should vote. There was the Sun newspaper fronting these huge front pages that people were using in their windows. And then these extraordinary stories that then started appearing both before the referendum and after the result, while the British government really tried to work out what it was. And they're quite extraordinary front pages because none of them is working on the basis of agreed facts. This is what you must think, and if you dare to stand in our way. These are slightly menacing front pages, I think, especially in the context of a campaign in which an MP had been murdered in the middle, this heightened tension that was going on, and people just using these slightly menacing enemies of the people, ignore the will of the people at your peril, crush the saboteurs. That sort of idea of putting MPs almost in the crosshairs of these are the bad guys. That sort of similarity there between the Mail and the Telegraph, this sort of what used to be a big distinction between the broadsheet press and the tabloid press, using the same techniques. And these, as I said, the use of this front page. And these very ropey stories in which some days later, or some months later, or some years later, a tiny correction would say, well, okay, that wasn't true. That was remarkable, and it was the very next day they came up with 54 pages on page 2. But it was almost as though the respect for facts had been ditched. And it's a footnote in history that the person whose byline is on those 2 remarkable front pages is one James Slack, CBE, no less, who then went on to become the Downing Street spokesman for May and Boris Johnson, and is now back in the business as the deputy editor of The Sun. So this sort of aspect of blurring ideology and journalism to get the result that you wanted was really a feature of that campaign. That was something that came out during the Leveson inquiry, which unveiled quite a lot of private correspondence, or correspondence they thought would be private. There's the CEO of the Telegraph, not the editor of the Telegraph. We desperately want there to be a Conservative government and for you to be our next Prime Minister. We, being the Telegraph, but he's supposed to be the commercial guy. We will do all we can to bring that about and to give you the great support in the grueling months ahead. And as we know, fair weather trend will be there too when you are in Downing Street. And these were remarkable documents that emerged during the Leveson inquiry of people whose idea of journalism had really changed into something in which team you were on really mattered more than what you were saying. And that I commented before on how the Telegraph, that would have been an extraordinary front page for the Telegraph to have produced actually at any time in its history. The Telegraph, whether you shared its politics or not, was a serious broadsheet paper, and there it was devoting its front page to a piece of commentary from Boris Johnson. Again, this is a sort of slightly nerdy inside Fleet Street point, but you have to say the brilliant editor in some ways of the Daily Mail, Paul Dacre, has mentored a number of people who have spread out into Fleet Street, and there are 3 of them at the moment editing papers. And when I read the Times every day, I can definitely see the genetic strain of the Daily Mail in the Times. So there's an idea, and I would say it's the overriding idea of what British journalism is at the moment. That way of editing is what British journalism is, it's quite a compelling idea of journalism, and I think it's very removed from the journalism that is needed today. And in a way, it's an echo back, if there are press historians who've written about this, but this was a book in 1957, I think, by a historian called Francis Williams, who talked about how advertising had liberated these titles which had been the hack titles in the early 19th century. And there was a period of about 150 years when advertising enabled papers, if they wanted to be free of these kind of political ideologies. But you could argue now that as advertising is no longer there, that they're returning to their comfort zone of serving their filter bubbles, their echo chambers, which of course is the very thing that newspapers accuse the internet of. We're the people who have the craft, who can reveal the truth to you. You shouldn't trust the internet because the internet is just an echo chamber. And there's this sense of actually the echo chamber is the comfortable space to be in. Now, the story that the tabloid press said at the time, or the Brexit press, was, you're just sour, all you Remainers, because you read it wrong, and we were in tune with the British people, and you weren't. That was a survey a couple of weeks ago from YouGov, and on every single metric 5 years later, there are extremely negative views about how Brexit has worked out. The green ink are the positive views, and there's not much green ink on that chart. Business, the economy, you personally, NHS, migration, cost of living, national security. So you could say that the British press had a short-term win ideologically in getting Brexit over the line, but in their job, which I think is what the public want more broadly, as we had on the earlier chart, of people who are the objective observers rather than participants in. I think that's a chart that it shows that the short-term gains came at a big cost. So if that was one of the 2 big consequential stories of our life, I would say that climate change is the other. And again, with climate change, I sort of feel most people know what they want, this is an extremely complicated, in a way, terrifying dilemma that the world faces. And it's really a case for calm analysis. Facts we can agree on. And you would think most newspapers editors would say, well, we want the scientifically trained people in our newsrooms who can take this very complicated picture, make it simple for the readers, but to give them information that, as I said earlier, is really essential for the whole political process, because the politicians we're asking to make these really tough decisions have to have some sense that there's an agreed story that they're playing into. And once again, the British press says that they did not rise to the challenge. Now, I'm speaking in a way negatively about a lot of what happened, and you know, I should acknowledge that there are many brilliant science reporters. There were many honest political correspondents, but I think the picture I described with Brexit was, as I said, the main picture. And there was some really, I think climate change journalism has struggled, even with the best reporters, to rise to the challenge of how to tackle this subject, because it's so important that you could argue it should be on the front page in some form every week, certainly, if not every day. Every month, absolutely, but even in the quantity of coverage that the climate change is getting from the media, it's not really there. This is the shocking thing, that for 20 years, if you had to name the two most prolific and most used correspondents who were commentating on climate change, they would be these men, Christopher Booker and James Delingpole. Both of them arts graduates of great universities, I'm sorry to say. But the point being, they were not trained scientists. They were, one was a historian, one was an English graduate. And Delingpole in particular was a sort of arch joker in the sort of Boris Johnson, you know, P.G. Woodhouse mode, treated the whole thing as a tremendous joke. And Booker himself, not blameless, writing in the Sunday Telegraph. There was Booker. Arctic ice is not vanishing after all. And that was his obituary notice in his own paper in the Telegraph. Sort of, you know, again, sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek. He stuck to his obsessions, even when, what's the phrase? They were shown to be based on inaccuracies. So even when he was wrong, he persisted in believing that he was right. And even his editor, Max Hastings, talked about his fanatical hostility to Europe increasingly distorted his journalism. But it wasn't just Europe, it wasn't just climate change, it was asbestos, global warming. There is no link between passive smoking and cancer. The Arctic ice isn't vanishing at all. And it came to the point where George Monbiot in The Guardian thought, actually, he's so wrong on so much science and willfully misleading the readers of the Sunday Telegraph that he was amounting to reckless endangerment of the public. So it wasn't a secret that what he was doing was so misguided. It was just that the papers didn't really mind. People liked reading him. Delingpole, University of Oxford, BA English. That was his kind of mission statement. He was the climate change correspondent of Breitbart, immensely influential American paper. Man-made global warming is evidently and demonstrably not a problem. The people who pretend otherwise are crooks, liars, idiots, or shills. Fossil fuels aren't running out. They are the ideal solution to our energy needs. Renewables are a waste of everyone's time. There's copious evidence to support all these statements. This is revolution. We've got truth and justice on our side. We owe the enemy nothing, and we really shouldn't count our job done until we've crushed them, seen them driven before us, and heard the lamentations of their women. Tee-hee-hee. It's the same that aspect of the whole thing's a bit of a joke, except this is sort of more or less what Donald Trump believes, and is, I suspect, going to be more or less the standpoint of the current administration. the sinister thing is if you put his name into a search engine, this man who you would think would be the last person that anybody would use to comment on climate change is all over the place. His articles, he was just the go-to guy for climate change in so many publications, both here and abroad. And at this point, you think there's a sort of almost a death wish in the British press, because we know that they don't trust us. We're trying to persuade people that journalism has a craft, that is, we've got this toolkit for revealing the truth, and yet we behave like this in Brexit and climate change with the most important stories of the day. This was a survey done for the Reuters Institute recently, which looked at whether things had changed much they measured the period up to 2018, then to 2014, and the period 2014 to 24, and they broke down skepticism into three different types. One was skepticism about the very evidence, is climate change a thing? The second one was about the process. You remember all the attacks on scientists who were working in this field and questioning their bona fides. And then the final version is, well, what are we going to do about it? And this is against a background where actually a lot of people, 78% of Brits, do support international measures to reduce emissions. And yet we've got a very high level of skepticism in our press. And the results there were, so that was the skepticism, the different types of skepticism, pretty marked 10 years ago. Process skepticism pretty marked, and response skepticism, so all these pieces that are questioning what we should be doing about it, very high. And then they broke it down by left-wing, right-wing, centre-right papers. So 10 years ago, no left-wing papers were questioning the evidence or the process. And now, thankfully, everyone now agrees on the evidence and the process, but a huge spike in articles about the response. And this was the Telegraph. Again, they just looked at the Telegraph, and high degrees of all kinds of skepticism 10 years ago. So that's gone down on the number of people who question the evidence or the process, but huge response, but huge skepticism on the response. There are other factors at work. I've talked about the ideology, how ideology is trumping everything else, but there is, I mean, I was thinking last night that the Cambridge Evening News that I worked on, I was really lucky to work on a paper that behaved like a proper paper and believed in the role of reporting. And the paper has now been taken over by a company called Reach. And Reach is now notorious. There's a thing on the right saying that the reporters are now being asked to write 8 stories a day. And repeatedly, the publisher sets page views or clicks as the main metric for the year. This is a guy who comes from Ladbrokes. And at the bottom left, there's the Murdoch's organization offering an Australian title, bonuses for clicks. You can't think of a more misguided way of approaching journalism than to do either of those things. Nick Davis, a long time ago, my colleague Nick Davis on The Guardian, wrote a book called Flat Earth News, in which he coined the term churnalism. And if you're doing 8 stories a day, that's all you're doing. You have the press release. You don't have time to interrogate the press release on the because you have to write 8 stories a day. So you're just toning over press releases. And it's a mislabel to call it journalism because it isn't. It's journalism. And if your only target if you're being incentivized or your publisher has said, our only metric for you is page views, well, you're probably not going to write stories about climate change because that chart I showed you earlier was actually people don't necessarily want to read about it. They want to be informed about it, but you're probably not going to get many clicks. So the incentives that are being put in place on papers like the Cambridge Evening News are now sort of anti-journalistic. I'm coming to the end. There's Steve Bannon who coined this phrase, flood the zone with shit, and I think we've seen what that means in the last month. It's just this overwhelming quantity of news, and I suppose the one thing I'm saying tonight is that at the very time when you do need people who are going to say, well, actually, this is based on a lie, this is completely untrue, there is some truth in this, they have been A, overwhelmed by it, B, I think we've lost that craft, and C, we've lost the trust. People don't believe that at this moment when journalism should be the people in this wild abyss of chaos, information chaos that we're living in. And it's quite revealing that if you follow Elon Musk on Twitter, which I don't recommend, but he does the same thing as, do you remember Trump used to religiously go for the New York Times, one of the best newspapers in the world, and dismiss it as fake news. And now they're going, Musk going for Reuters and Associated Press, as if to say, look, you don't believe these guys. Even the best of them are all liars and fake news. And the obvious reason is that if we can discredit them, then we can discredit. You have no reason to believe anything. That's Elon Musk recently. The legacy media is pure propaganda. You are the media now. It's a quite terrifying statement. That was Steve Bannon. This is just to end on the role of the BBC. Steve Bannon, clever if weird man. But that was a blog that he wrote 20 years ago. The undermining of the BBC's credibility has to happen. The creation of a Fox News equivalent, well, that happened, GB News. To shift the center of gravity, development of web networks, scrutinizing the BBC, providing information to commercial rivals, with an interest in undermining the BBC's credibility during the election, and even more so in a EU referendum. There will be a huge need for the BBC's reporting of issues to be scrutinized and taken apart minute by minute. He saw it coming. This was whatever it was, eight years before the referendum. He knew what had to be done to neutralize the most trusted news organization. And if you ever wonder why there are so many attacks on the BBC, it is because it is actually the most trusted news organization. And if you're going to get inside the mind of these people, you have to understand that's how they work. So I think we're in a bad place. I think we're in a sense, we've gone back to the early 19th century, where this craft of journalism started to happen. And it feels to me like people are now, the surveys show that people now no longer know who to trust. And the belief that there is a craft of reporting was the best way, in Carl Bernstein's phrase, to get the best obtainable version of the truth is hard to believe. Why does it matter? Well, we saw last summer how one tweet, which was complete misinformation or disinformation, could lead to riots all over Britain just by putting one piece of wrong information out there, precisely knowing the effect that it would have. So, we live in an age of information chaos. People don't know who to believe. Elites are well served. If you take out a subscription to the New York Times, you'll be very well informed. But the 97% of Americans who don't have a subscription to the New York Times aren't doing so well. I would argue that however you define journalism, and I've suggested that there is a craft there, which would be well served if we could recover it. But we have to face the fact that whatever we call journalism is not well trusted today. It's easily overwhelmed. It's easily discredited. We've seen that in the last month. And the form of journalism that is most trusted, I think, is the easiest one to knock over. I did a piece last week looking at what would happen if in Britain we had a Trump figure who could come in, and you'd think the first person they would go for is the BBC, because those authoritarians always go for the media first. There's much of the media that doesn't need to be captured. They've more or less captured themselves. But you would go for the BBC, and I think it's remarkably easy to knock the BBC over. And the old man, writing in 1921, has still said the wisest thing ever to be said about journalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan, for an amazing tribute to Lisa and a wonderful analysis of what's happening in media at the moment. We do not have time for questions, either in the room or online. Do use the Q&A feature on Zoom. If there's no one in the room, yes, so if we have this one here, if you just come round, I can see lots of hands, so I'll do my best.
Thank you very much indeed. Your talk was fascinating. And I loved that image with the three actors of the state, the authorities, the journalists, and the people. And as I was thinking through what you were saying, I realized that I perhaps didn't agree with one of the last things on your last slide, where you said that the people don't know who to believe. My suspicion is that people do know whom they should believe, but for some reason they choose not to. We know that the BBC is pretty much reliable, and yet we collectively choose to listen to all sorts of things that we know in our hearts are really unreliable. Any idea why?
That's a very profound question. I mean, George Orwell years ago did a chart in which he listed what he regarded to be the best and most reliable papers and their circulation. And it was almost in inverse proportion to what was actually sold. So those papers that were selling 4 million copies a day of The Sun, at some level we probably knew that The Sun was a joke, and yet 4 million copies a day were being sold. And Mrs. Thatcher was the first politician who thought, why am I speaking to the Times when there are 4 million voters over here? And she almost fitted her politics to the politics of The Sun. I think you're right that the BBC always shows up in surveys. Surveys also do show that people say we don't know who to trust. And I think politically it would be difficult to imagine a full-throated attack on the BBC. In reality, I don't think it is. So I had a podcast chat the other day with three historians of the BBC. Day one, you announce that you're defunding it. I mean, it's not set up on any basis in which you couldn't do that. You just say, well, we're abolishing the license fee. It's going to be a subscription service in future. Day two, you sack the chairman. Been done before. Mrs. Thatcher sacked, put in Marmaduke Hussey to be the chair of the BBC. The chairman sacks the director general. You've more or less captured the BBC. So this wonderful organization that feels as though it is politically popular, trusted, essential to our understanding of the news, I think is quite fragile.
In the front of the, yes, in black. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was just a fantastic lecture, incredibly important, and
You may have to speak up.
Am I speaking? Yes? Yeah. And I just have enormous gratitude to you for giving it to us. I have a question that is making me very nervous to ask, which is I wondered if one turned it slightly upside down and started with the thought that actually we all lie, that our natural form of social relationships is some degree of lying, and that what is rare is the people who tell the truth.
That may be true. What would you want of our media if that is true?
The few people who tell the truth.
That we want the media to so the underlying message of what I was saying.
Not disagreeing with
you.
I'm just saying there's a way in which it's making me reverse the question slightly and saying that the oddity is people who tell the truth.
Yeah.
Not the oddity of the people who lie.
Yeah.
That basically social relations are not always heinous lies, just ordinary everyday lies. The sort of that we don't tell the truth naturally. That social relationships are based not on telling the truth, basically, and therefore therefore the rarity
Yeah.
is those people who tell
Yeah, I think that's very profound. It is the problem that pollsters, of course, face, that people often don't tell the truth to pollsters, so actually gauging what the public really thinks is difficult.
I think the next question I'll take is one online before we go to one just at the back there to give you time to get there. How would you suggest improving the status of journalism and fact-checking?
Well, there's one. I mean, first of all, I think somehow the British press needs to. The striking thing is there is no real conversation about this that I'm aware of, and I think I would be aware of it. So there is no forum in which the British press can really discuss, that sort of Millwall slide. I think they've probably got beyond the point of saying we don't care, because actually they're being commercially threatened now. They may misread why they're being commercially threatened. But I think somehow, and Leveson was not the right forum, because Leveson was really sort of a forensic inquiry into the British press. But somehow you need to get journalists, probably not editors and proprietors, because I don't think they'll ever change, but journalists who by and large, I think, aren't signed up to this kind of journalism. It's not why they went into journalism, in order to change the mood. I mean, there's one simple thing that the American press does that I think would be hugely beneficial, which is they have different editors for comment and news. Sounds like an obvious thing, but when you think of the great American editors anybody might have heard of, Ben Bradley in All the President's Men, Marty Barron more recently, Dean Baquet at the New York Times, they were called the executive editors, because the business of finding out what the facts are is an entirely different skill from what you should think about it. And if you've got the same person in charge of both, then I think that becomes a distortive thing. How you get that to happen, I don't know. In my last year at The Guardian, I did something similar like that. I put Jonathan Friedland in charge of comment, because I thought it was important. It was important to separate these things off, and I thought it was a bad idea to have one editor in charge. But it would be interesting to see which British paper would be the first paper to go down that road.
Question in the middle over there.
By the way, I should say, and I can see Chris Elliott in the audience who worked for the Sunday Telegraph, but the Telegraph actually in its prime, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, had somebody who ran the news pages. I think he was called Peter Eastwood. And then your sort of Bill Deeds character would come in and write the elegant leaders. And it was a paper that, whatever you thought of the Telegraph, its news pages were rigorous. So it's in a way, the Telegraph was that model.
Hello, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I've got a question, because I'm a person that has lost faith in mainstream media over the last 16 months. And that is because I feel like I've been living in a parallel reality from what I've been seeing online in terms of what's been happening in Gaza and what I'm reading and watching on mainstream media. Only today, I read that the deputy Knesset speaker said the Palestinians, are outcasts. No one in the world wants them. Children and women must be separated, and adults must be eliminated. I've seen footage of IDF soldiers laughing about dogs feeding on the dead bodies of Palestinians, and I've heard that 6 babies have died of hypothermia. I won't see any of this on the mainstream news, and that to me is completely unacceptable. Only a few days ago, a documentary for the first time humanizing Palestinian children was taken down from the BBC iPlayer due to pressure from sources that I think we all know where that's come from. It's been taken down permanently. That was the only documentary we've had humanizing Palestinians, and it's gone. 166
Can we let Alan respond?
Okay, my question is, why is there tumbleweed amongst the British media about this? The only journalists who are actually covering this are being detained and harassed under anti-terrorism legislation in the UK. What's going on?
Yeah. How long have we got? I mean, it's a very good question and it doesn't lend itself to a simple answer. I mean, I think some of what I've been talking about, and I didn't go into the reasons behind the ideology because that's complicated, but some of it is to do with ownership. Quite a lot of it is to do with ownership. So if you're working for a paper that has in some way an ideology, and it's no secret that Rupert Murdoch, for instance, was very anti-European, so you were not going to thrive working for Rupert Murdoch if you wrote very pure European stuff. So there's that sort of earworm that ticks in the ears of editors and the people who work for the editors. So there would be a pro-Israeli inclination in much of the British media. To be fair, I would like to try to be fair. I mean, it's been a very difficult story to cover for mainstream media because no reporters have been allowed in. And so the only witnesses have been people on the ground. And that, I think, is why the BBC has got into problems with this story. I don't know enough about he sounds like a middle-ranking Hamas official. I think he's Deputy Agricultural Minister whose son was narrating it. I think the BBC could have prevented a certain amount of trouble by owning up to that, by admitting it, because I think they opened a flank. You and I might agree that it's impossible, that that Hamas is so pervasive in the Gaza, it's difficult to find people who are not associated with Hamas in some way. But I think the BBC probably opened a flank by not just thinking carefully enough about how this film would have been attacked. But I think you're right to say that, and this is where the chart that shows, Facebook is there with 2.6 billion. A lot of the coverage that has come out of Gaza in the absence of Western correspondents being able to go in has come from Gazans themselves. There was one photographer who had 17 million followers on Instagram, who I was following, who was just the most, he was John Edward Taylor. He was just standing there, Mumtaz Aziz, and he was just taking pictures day after day. He was the person saying, this is happening. And there was, you're right to say, there was a huge disparity between the pictures that were coming out from him and the general portrayal of the story in much of the Western media.
Question over here.
Thanks. You started in local news, and we used to have a lot of quality newspapers in local and regional news. Much of that isn't around anymore. So how important was that to you, training you in the skills of journalism? And how should we be training journalists of the future? And do you feel optimistic that it is going to generate the quality that your generation have had?
Well, not if you're working for a Reach title, sadly. I mean, there are some, I was talking to some students earlier, there are some little startups, the Manchester Mill, the Bristol Cable, the Guildford Dragon. My old colleague Jim Waterson has just started something. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, that a city the size of London can't sustain a local newspaper any longer. But he started a little startup and is doing good work. And they're, in a way, swimming in the opposite tide to Reach. So Manchester Mill may only publish 3 stories a week, but there'll be long-form investigations. So there are little glimmers of light. And then there's the whole question of what AI will do. I won't rehearse the pessimistic story of AI, which is frightening and terrifying and disheartening, but we don't all want to go home and drown our sorrows. But there is a version of the BBC. So say, when Chris and I were on the Cambridge Evening News, we would go to all the council meetings, all the police meetings, all the national health meetings. We would be in every meeting, we would be in every court. Realistically, that's unaffordable now. No, I don't think any newspaper, local newspaper, is ever going to be able to go back to that. But if the BBC were to spend, let's say, £1 billion, invest £1 billion on AI, and the aim was to have a form of AI reporting or capturing of every meeting in the country, That would be an enormous start, and it would get lots of things wrong to begin with, but it would be the most astonishing record. And I'm pretty sure that AI will be up to doing that soon, within the next 10 years. So I think, the optimistic version is that because society does need facts, agreed facts, or it falls apart, that the supply of those facts is a bit like the supply of clean water or clean air. And somebody, I hope, is thinking about how AI could help fill the gaps that we used to do when we were local reporters.
We're beginning to run out of time, but I'll try and fit in the last few questions if I possibly can. Let's do one online that I think follows on partly from that. Do you think it's possible to moderate social media effectively, especially since they're mostly under the thumb of the US tech giants?
Well, with my Facebook Oversight Board hat, what can I say? I mean, AI is going to be part of the picture there. So if you've got whatever it is, 2.5 billion bits of content going up I'm making these numbers up, but enormous numbers on YouTube and Facebook of bits of content, maybe 500 million a day. No team of moderators can deal with that. So you're going to have automated systems, and to be fair to Facebook, they have had automated systems. It's been a bit discouraging to hear Mark Zuckerberg talk about not doing fact-checking but going to community notes, because I think that's yet to be proved that that's a better alternative. But what is I think more striking is this division that is opening up between the sort of Elon Musk, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance view of what they would call censorship, so that any attempt to moderate is censorship, and the view of free speech in the European Union and the UK, in which a form of moderation is necessary. And I don't know how these big tech companies are going to resolve that.
I'll try to fit as many as I can. I won't be able to get them all done. Can I start right at the back here? I've seen a number of hands, and we'll see how we go.
Thank you very much for that really stimulating talk. I just want to come back to something that was raised a bit earlier and just ask if you could elaborate a bit more. You paint a very gloomy picture of where we are today. We're in a mess, as you say. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you, as someone who's spent his whole life in journalism and pursuing journalism, practicing journalism, defending journalism, how you see the path out of this mess. What is your view of what can we do to try to get out of this swamp in which we are now located? So I'm sure you must have thought about that, and I wonder if you could give us your thoughts based on your experience of how we move forward in this situation.
Well, first of all, we all have to defend the BBC, because the BBC is an amazing, it's a business model that works. You pay your license fee or you go to jail. I wish we'd had that on The Guardian. So that idea of a universally available source of broadly reliable information at a local level, at a national level, at an international, is priceless. And all these people who want to come in with a wrecking ball and destroy it should be sent packing. I mean, that's we as citizens can try and stop that from happening. And then I think there is a wider discussion about seeing journalism as a public good. I may have been a bit gloomy tonight, but underneath, I hope you can see my conviction that we do need the John Redwood Taylor standing at the edge of the square saying, no, that didn't happen, that did happen. So we need these people in society. We call them journalists. Journalists, I think there is a craft there that should be trusted. But it's one of the things that distorts it is the lack of the economic model, certainly at a local level. And you get these bizarre incentives that are being put in, which will destroy journalism, not make it. And if we can start the discussion about journalism as a public good, as necessary as clean air and clean water, and then it's a story of market failure. That's what public goods are. And then you can start having a discussion about how you sustain this. In Australia, they had a moment where they decided they would just go and shake Google down and get, millions, hundreds of millions out of them. They thought the answer was then to give it to Rupert Murdoch, the existing players. I think we could probably have a more imaginative conversation than that. But there may be forms of windfall tax or whatever to sustain the kind of reporting that we need. So I don't think all is lost.
Very quickly from online, are you aware of the organisation magazine Positive News? How do you find their journalism?
Blunt answer, no.
Right. That was a very, very quick answer. I see 3 hands left. So if I take a very, very quick question, if I can try and get all 3 questions and get you to answer as you'd like to those, but very quick questions.
Yeah, quick one. You did touch, thanks for the amazing talk. You did touch upon it lightly, but I started my career as a journalist, and one of the things which was very frustrating, most journalists start with a lot of ideological, not ideology in the negative sense, but with fire, and that's sort of quashed because of the increasing corporatization of the media, politicization of the media, which even the Observers was recently taken over, and this is a global phenomenon where your stories are stopped because they're corporate interests, political interests. And so the larger picture, and what is it doing to journalism, the reporter at the ground level? Thanks.
And can I say there's one here, over there?
Thank you. I just wondered if we didn't really touch on the idea of whether people how far people are retreating from news altogether, and whether you see that happening, that kind of refusal even to go there. So whatever journalism is trying to do becomes impossible.
And finally,
mine's almost the same.
Perfect.
I'm a school teacher, and over the last 20 years, I've seen fewer and fewer students engage with the mainstream media. It's accelerated, and especially the news media.
Yeah.
BBC News, Panorama, Channel 4 News. Very, very few students watch it.
Yeah. Okay, I think I can condense those in two answers, I think. So the first about journalists being ideological. I mean, my sense, I did a very interesting thing with, I chair the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford, and the new director, Rasmus Nielsen, who's a brilliant analyst of newspapers, but he's a Danish civil servant. He didn't know many journalists. So I said, let's go up to Manchester and we'll find a room above a pub and we'll go and meet lots of journalists in the Northwest. And it was kind of fascinating because they were all people who'd gone into journalism for not to be ideological, actually to do the John Edward Taylor bit. They just wanted to be witnesses in society. And they all felt crushed by the job that they were having to do, because this perception of the job that had come down from on high, which ends in the sort of journalism I've been talking about today, was not what they went into journalism to do. So I think this idea of sort of starting the debate from below, maybe if the National Union of Journalism was a buzzier organization, it could begin there. But saying, look, we don't want to do. I mean, when Nick Davis exposed the News of the World and all the criminal practices there, he was attacked for being anti-tabloid. His sources were all within the News of the World. The News of the World newsroom was saying, we didn't sign up to come in and hack celebrities' phones. His sources were the journalists who were in rebellion against the kind of newspaper that it was. So I think this sort of bottom-up movement. This question of news avoidance, I mean, it's got a name, news avoidance, and again, Rasmus Nielsen, if you Google Rasmus Nielsen news avoidance, he's written a book on the subject, and it's a big thing that people are increasingly just saying, either because it's like your Gaza question, it's just too awful to think about, I just can't bear to think about it any longer, or the suffering in Ukraine is, there's nothing I can do about it, I'd rather not know about it, or because of distrust of journalists, I don't actually trust them. So news avoidance is something that is absolutely on the radar of media academics, though whether the Millwall factor is kicking into newsrooms and people saying, I don't care, it would be short-sighted to think that. And your students, I mean, I do think one of the things that needs to happen is for media literacy to come into the classroom at about the age of 6, I think, so that by the time students are equipped, are being exposed to this world of information chaos. They have the critical faculties to judge between good and bad, to look at the kind of headlines that we've been looking at today, and to be able to understand where they're coming from and to work out who to trust and who not to trust. People used to laugh at the idea of media studies. It was a sort of woke, lefty humanities thing. I think it's actually necessary absolutely necessary to equip kids now. And I think if they were equipped and if they had that kind of, really brilliant teaching early on, that by the time they became your students, they'd be more engaged.
Alan, thank you again for that wonderful lecture, that wonderful tribute, and these wonderful answers to questions. We could have gone on for many hours. I can see more hands here. There's more questions online. But I think we'll call it a day there. So thank you very, very much for joining us for this lecture.